Amina, Zara, and Laila were just working girls trying to survive, but when machetes struck the streets they called home, their anger turned into a fight for survival that would shock the entire city, in the city where chaos and opportunity collided. The streets were alive in a way that could either enchant or terrify. Neon signs flickered over crowded markets, and the smell of fried food mixed with the stench of exhaust fumes from endless motorcycles. Vendors shouted over one another, calling out their prices, hoping to lure customers before the next competitor did. Every corner had a story, some vibrant and alive, others dark and dangerous. Among the crowds, young women moved with purpose, balancing baskets of goods or stacks of fabric on their heads. They were part of the city's invisible engine, working long hours for little pay, their lives a continuous rhythm of labor and survival. The tension in the air was almost tangible, a mix of frustration, exhaustion, and quiet anger. Many of these women had dreams of better lives, but each day seemed to chip away at hope. The streets, once seen as a path to freedom and livelihood, had begun to feel like a battlefield. Shadows of passers-by sometimes concealed more sinister figures lurking for the slightest opportunity. And opportunity, in this city, often came with sharp edges. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, a sudden scream sliced through the usual noise. A machete attack had erupted on a busy street corner, leaving shoppers frozen and vendors retreating behind their stalls. Panic spread in moments, and the city felt as though it had taken a collective step backward. The victims were women who had only minutes ago been working peacefully, now injured and terrified. People called the authorities, but by the time help arrived, the attackers had vanished into the night. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the attack was part of a gang feud, others whispered it was a personal vendetta. Residents spoke in hushed tones about the frequency of violent incidents that went unreported. Fear gripped neighborhoods, with families urging children and working women to return home earlier than usual. Streetlights flickered over deserted alleys, and markets emptied faster than ever before. Even those who had once moved confidently through the streets now glanced over their shoulders, quickening their pace. The city had always been unpredictable, but that night, it seemed particularly dangerous. Every face in the crowd carried tension, every shadow hinted at unseen threats, and the ordinary rhythm of life had been replaced with a sense of looming dread. Yet, amidst the fear, a spark of resilience quietly ignited. People began to watch each other more closely, to warn and protect. The streets that never slept now held stories of both danger and determination. A stage where survival demanded vigilance, courage, and sometimes sheer luck. As days passed, the city seemed to pulse with a nervous energy, a tension that settled in the bones of its residents. Incidents that once appeared random began to form patterns. A purse snatched near the bus stop at dawn, a man cornered and beaten outside a small shop, another machete sighting in a dimly lit alley. At first, they seemed isolated, separate flashes of danger. But detectives and neighborhood watchers started to notice similarities. The timing, the locations, the way shadows moved in unison with sudden attacks. The streets were not just chaotic, they were strategic, shaped by unseen hands with carefully planned intentions. Witnesses described fleeting glimpses of the perpetrators, figures moving too quickly to catch, faces half hidden under hoods or scarves, disappearing into the crowded city before anyone could react. Security cameras captured blurry images that offered no clarity, only adding to the sense of unease. Even regular commuters felt the invisible pressure, sensing that danger could appear at any corner. What had once been an ordinary path to work now felt like a gauntlet, each step measured, each glance over the shoulder calculated. Social media amplified the fear. Short videos of violent encounters circulated rapidly, creating a virtual map of risk zones. Neighbors shared warnings, photos of suspicious individuals, and advice on which streets to avoid. But the network of information, while helpful, also heightened panic. Every post reminded the city that the threat was constant and unpredictable, a silent presence lurking behind everyday life. Amid the rising chaos, small acts of courage emerged. A shopkeeper who chased a thief through narrow alleys, a delivery girl who helped a victim escape, a passerby who blocked an attacker's path. These moments were rare but notable. They reminded residents that the streets, while dangerous, were not entirely without resistance. Yet, the city's law enforcement struggled to respond in time. Police patrols could only cover so much ground, and investigations often relied on fragments of evidence or shaky eyewitness accounts. Criminals took advantage of every gap, slipping through the cracks with calculated precision. The city had become a chessboard of threats and defenses. Ordinary citizens were pawns, sometimes unaware of the moves being made around them, yet capable of surprising acts of strategy and courage. Each day brought new challenges, new fears, and new glimpses of bravery. Slowly, the residents began to realize that survival required more than caution. It demanded observation, cooperation, and a willingness to confront danger even when it was hidden in the ordinary, everyday streets of their city. Amid the city's growing fear, a quiet resistance began to form among the women who worked its streets and markets. They were the ones who had endured long hours under fluorescent lights, who carried heavy loads of goods from dawn until nightfall, and who had learned to navigate the chaos with a mix of skill and patience. But the constant threat of violence had stirred something deeper than caution. It had awakened anger, determination, and a need to protect not just themselves, but each other. The women began to watch each other's backs in subtle ways. A glance, a nod, or a shift in position could signal danger, and the group responded instinctively. Some carried tools that could serve as weapons if necessary, while others memorized the quickest escape routes through crowded streets and narrow alleys. They shared information about suspicious individuals, times when attacks were most likely, and areas that had become too dangerous to enter alone. What had started as whispers and cautious conversations grew into an informal network of vigilance and support. One young woman stood out among them. She worked long shifts in a textile factory, but in the evenings, she patrolled the streets with a few trusted friends, documenting incidents and helping those who had been attacked. Her courage inspired others, and soon small groups of women were recognized by neighbors as protectors of their communities. They moved swiftly, quietly, and with purpose, turning once dangerous streets into zones where criminal activity was more likely to be interrupted than ignored. The city began to take notice, even if authorities remained slow to respond. Stories of women fending off attackers, rescuing victims, and coordinating safe routes circulated through social media and word of mouth. Each success, no matter how small, became a symbol of defiance. Anger that had once been private and simmering now fueled action, and the women discovered a strength they had never recognized in themselves. The streets themselves seemed to change under their influence. Dark alleys and crowded market corners still held risk, but the presence of the women brought a measure of reassurance to ordinary citizens. Fear had not disappeared, but it had shifted. Attackers were no longer guaranteed anonymity, and the city's most vulnerable residents were no longer entirely defenseless. In their anger and determination, the women had become more than workers. They were guardians, a force that challenged the violence and claimed control over the streets they had once only feared. Just as the city began to find a fragile sense of control, a shocking revelation shattered the fragile calm. Investigators discovered that many of the Machete attacks and street crimes were not isolated outbursts of anger or random violence. They were carefully orchestrated by a single organized group, operating in the shadows and exploiting fear to maintain control over entire neighborhoods. What had seemed like chaos now had a sinister method, a hidden strategy designed to intimidate residents and manipulate the flow of daily life. The group's tactics were calculated. They targeted busy streets and market areas during peak hours, knowing that attacks in crowded spaces would maximize panic and disruption. They avoided areas under heavy police surveillance but struck where ordinary citizens were most vulnerable. Their goal was not robbery or personal revenge, it was influence. By creating an environment of fear, they could dominate small businesses, extract favors, and assert control over vendors and workers who might otherwise resist. Residents were stunned to learn that what they had thought were random dangers were part of a larger intentional plan. Families realized that the women they had watched bravely confront attackers were facing adversaries far more organized and strategic than anyone had imagined. Fear, which had once felt uncontrollable, was now clearly directed, and the city's streets had been a stage for manipulation. Yet, the revelation did not lead to despair. On the contrary, it galvanized the women who had been quietly resisting. Armed with knowledge about the gang's patterns, they intensified their efforts. They mapped out routes, documented suspicious movements, and shared information in real time, creating a network of intelligence that even the criminals had not anticipated. Their anger, once a simmering frustration, became a weapon of strategy and coordination. Neighborhoods that had seemed weak and exposed slowly transformed into areas of resilience. The presence of vigilant women, coupled with heightened awareness among residents, disrupted the gang's plans. Attacks were intercepted, victims were guided to safety, and the group's dominance began to waver. What had started as an orchestrated campaign of terror was now being countered by the very people it had sought to control. The city's landscape of danger and fear had changed yet again. Darkness still lurked, but the women's resistance proved that knowledge, courage, and coordination could confront even the most calculated threats. The streets remained unpredictable, but the balance of power was shifting. Ordinary citizens, once pawns in a cruel game, were beginning to assert their influence, and for the first time, survival was no longer entirely dictated by fear. The city never became completely safe, but the streets no longer held the same paralyzing fear. The women who had once been targets of violence had transformed into everyday heroes, their courage and vigilance reshaping the neighborhoods they called home. They moved through crowded markets, bus stops, and narrow alleys with a careful confidence, alert to danger yet unbowed by it. Their presence alone became a deterrent, a silent message that the city's streets could no longer be dominated by criminals with impunity. These women had created networks of protection that extended beyond their immediate circles. They coordinated shifts to watch over each other, communicated suspicious activities through discreet signals, and guided victims to safety when attacks occurred. Even strangers learned to trust and cooperate, creating a sense of community that had been absent during the height of fear. It was not just brute force that ensured survival, it was intelligence, preparation, and solidarity. The organized gang that had once terrorized neighborhoods found themselves increasingly frustrated. Their plans were disrupted more often than not. Their movements monitored and anticipated by the very people they sought to control. Streets that had been dark and isolated became zones of observation, where attackers risked exposure and resistance at every turn. The balance of power was shifting, and it was the ordinary citizens, particularly the women who had faced violence directly, who were now asserting influence. The city's residents began to understand an important truth: crime thrived where people felt powerless. When courage and cooperation replaced fear, even the most calculated threats could be challenged. Mothers walked their children home with steady steps, street vendors resumed evening shifts, and workers moved through markets with renewed confidence. The women's anger, once a private frustration, had become a catalyst for protection and change. Yet, the city remained a place of unpredictability. Machete attacks and street crime had not disappeared, but they no longer dictated the rhythm of everyday life. Residents learned to navigate danger with awareness and courage, and the women continued to stand at the forefront, ready to intervene when necessary. In the shadows and corners where threats lingered, the ordinary had become extraordinary. Through resilience, strategy, and unwavering determination, these working women had reclaimed control of the streets, proving that even in a city marked by violence, survival and bravery could coexist, and that everyday heroes often walked among those who seemed most ordinary.